Good morning, all, and welcome to this 1 hour webcast lunch and learn for the Georgia Bar section e-discovery and use of technology. Thank you for joining us today. Today's topic is digital forensic investigations. For those of you who don't know me, I chair this section, and this section is actually being rebooted post-COVID. So we have a full slate of programming this year. I'd be remiss not to announce, in addition to today's CLE program, we are having a joint social holiday event on December 14th in conjunction with Atlanta Women in E-Discovery and as well as the Atlanta Community for E-Discovery. So be on the lookout for information on that event. It'll be 6 to 9 at the AC Hotel in Dunwoody. And we also, you may have seen a call for speakers for a spring CLE event. If you have are interested in discussing electronic discovery or technology in this area, please feel free to reach out to myself or Lori Burton, who are named in that communication. We've got two additional esteemed speakers with us today. These are, two top experts in the field, serving, the Georgia market as well as clients nationally and internationally. Many of you know or have worked with these folks before. We have Johnny Lee. Johnny is the principal national practice leader for forensic technology services at Grant Thornton. He has over 25 years experience. He's a forensic investigator, management consultant, former attorney specializing in data analytics, digital forensics, and electronic discovery. Put him on the screen as well. He supports investigations, data breach response, and litigation. We also have David Sems. David Sems works at my firm at White Elm. David is a managing director at White Elm E-Discovery and founder of Connected Experts. David has over 20 years fraud investigation technology experience, including 11 years with the Big Four firm Ernst & Young. He's worked on countless, multiple hundreds of matters. I suppose at some point you stop counting matters involving extraction and analysis of digital evidence, in the forensic context. He's provided expert testimony on computer forensics in various courts throughout the country at the superior, state, and federal levels. So I'll get us going here. This is an area some of you may know well. If you've ever had a theft of trade secrets case, or certainly other matter involving evidence stored on a hard drive or server, you've probably been exposed to some of the tools and technology involved. Practitioners most familiar with some of the interface, attorney practitioners might be more familiar with the interface tools and review tools, but you might not be as familiar with some of the technology involved, some of the back-end tools that analysts use to extract and configure data stored on a drive. We're going to talk about some of those today and relate them to some cases. So on our first slide, this is really just a general overview of what an investigative process might look like. It's going from the far left to the right. These are important points, identifying, we're always starting identifying the purpose of the investigation. Usually the call that, e-discovery professionals, analysts first get is, hey, I need a drive image and, send me the data. So some of these drives can be, there's different types of drives, and some of them can be very complicated and have different types of data all over the place, especially even when you're talking about just a cell phone that might have 260 some gigs on it. It's a lot of information, and that information is stored in different ways in different places on the drive. So it's incumbent on the analyst to ask the right questions at the forefront, hopefully before the drive has been touched at all, to say, okay, this is what's relevant to the case, relate the task back to the case, and help the analyst, best determine in an analysis plan. So, that initial conversation obviously helps inform the analyst where to look, what programs or files are relevant. Are they looking for deleted files? Are they looking for evidence of drives being cleaned and wiped? Is there traces of that type of software on there? Is it just email, or is it just email that might be of interest? Just text, or might the facts also implicate looking at various chat apps and other areas of the drive, including Slack space? And we can talk a little more about that later in terms of carving out data on a drive that might no longer be associated with viewers or apps on the drive, but still remains. If we move across the continuum here, another important point would be just collecting this evidence in a sound manner. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we get that call from an IT department and you say, look, we've got this drive, we're concerned about some nefarious activity. We've already opened it up, we've looked around, we've searched some websites on it. It's like, okay, you've kind of tracked all over the evidence, and that can be problematic. Obviously, we want to maintain a clean drive through chain of custody and only image it before it's gone back into use, or not really use it at all, but do a clean forensic image of it that we can testify to at trial. Okay, so that's our continuum. Let's move along here. I'm going to turn it over to David, who's going to talk about, get into talking about some of these tools.
Yeah, so thanks. I mean, when we're talking about, this webinar is we're talking about telling a story. Well, it's kind of like one of the first questions we get. Well, what tools do you use? A lot of times we get that question, and there are a lot of tools out there that are available. It's the expertise of knowing how to use it and which tool to use when, and what the limitations of some of those tools are. So there's a lot of great tools out there that make it easier to do things where in the past it would take a lot longer to do. One of our tools that we use quite a bit is a product out of Germany. It's called X-Ways Forensics. Very rapid. If we need to do a rapid analysis of a drive really quickly, it's a very powerful tool that allows us to get in quickly, find things like deleted files that Mark was mentioning, and start recovering data and start analyzing. As we'll talk later about timestamps and how important that is and to telling a story. And knowing what bits and pieces and bytes and so forth that come together is so important. But other products that are out there, and these change names various times, but the big ones would be FTK, which is a big forensic tool that's used both for mobile forensics and desktop forensics. InCase, and then Magnet Forensics. Magnet Forensics, which is a forensic tool that also does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to trying to dig into some of these artifacts. One of the things with tools, though, is that they can be dangerous. So you have to know how to use it. Just like if you had a table saw and you didn't know how to use it, you can cut your finger off. So it's important to know how to use these tools. There are some other tools in the forensic space, Cellebrite being one of the biggest ones. That is a constant changing area, and we'll talk about that later in terms of the mobile forensics. But because of data privacy and technology changes so rapidly on mobile forensics, those tools are constantly being updated, and we're trying to stay one step ahead. If you're working either a criminal case or a civil case, a lot of the times you may or may not have access to that phone because it's either encrypted or that you don't have the password. So there are some tools to get past that. They cost a lot of money, but it is possible to get past some of that stuff. So in general, there's a lot of tools and available, and they don't come cheap, but they're very powerful and they do a great job. So Mark, do you want to take
Sure.
the next
Okay,
one?
so what all these wonderful tools, what do we use them for? Well, there's definitely a variety of cases. I won't read these out to folks. You might have your own experience on all the different types of cases where this comes into play. I can tell you what we're seeing a lot of more recently is the employment related cases, the theft of trade secrets cases, things ranging from a code of conduct violation, theft of trade secrets. Sometimes if you have a termination or dismissal and folks are negotiating severance, the company sometimes decides they want to take a look at whether there is a code violation on the drive. So we do see this stuff coming up often in those contexts, but there's other contexts. We recently had a case where the operative question was a mass tort case, and the operative question was whether or not the plaintiff was aware of the condition at a certain time such that their claim would have been outside of statute of limitations. So that involved retrieving a very, very old computer and looking at date criteria, searching the drive for any evidence that there was discussion or even research done on a very particular medical condition going back 7+ years. So different type of use there, but nevertheless you can see how that comes into play. David, I'll flip it back to you.
Yeah. And with those tools, there's various techniques that we can use. A lot of them do some of these things, but certainly, one of the first things that we do is the deleted documents. That's sort of one of the things that we have the ability to do. So just in general, so you're aware, and you may or may not be aware of this, but when you delete a document on most computer systems, it's not really gone. It's still there, but it can be recovered to some extent, depending on how the computer is configured. But most computers we can get, if it's been recently deleted, we have the ability to pull that back on a computer system. On a cell phone, it's a little bit harder to do that. Some of the other things that we do that become very important, I think one of the biggest ones is keyword searching, especially if you have a particular issue that you're trying to track down and try to figure out what's going on. Keyword searches can be very helpful, and that allows you to run across the entire drive at a physical level and do that. The other thing is that there's the one that we see a lot of too is if you're in a trade secrets type case, or where you wanted to see, did someone steal something? Did someone take something off the computer? Well, the computer actually does a pretty cool thing. It actually records what devices are plugged into it via USB or other mechanisms, and there's a log of that, so we know when the drive was plugged in, what the serial number of that drive is, and we can then start reconstructing the history and build it on a timeline and reconstruct what it is.
And I'll just add, I mean, often that's something we're asked really on a first call, or we bring up. It's okay, we think there's activity on this subject drive, but that person might have moved, especially in a trade secrets case, that person might have moved the data, through a USB drive or otherwise to other computers. So really, what is that USB stick drive relevant, or is there another computer that's relevant, and is a TRO needed? So if we can get in quickly and produce a report for the court that says, here's why we need 3 additional drives, and here's the serial numbers of those drives and when they were plugged in, that helps counsel that we deal with get through that TRO process.
Yeah. Now all of these sort of techniques and so forth, the important thing about that, and I think we have a slide that talks about it, and I think Mark touched on it earlier, and it's really these rules to live by. And I think this is really of the things that you need to be aware of when you're dealing with electronic evidence is that you never want to mishandle the evidence. And that can be a simple, when I say mishandle, it's not like you're actually going to, take a hard drive and just throw it on the floor or something like that. Certainly you don't want to do that. But just the mere fact of turning on a computer, IT turns it on. Hey, I want to do a quick look and see what's going on this computer. that's going to, and I'm going to log in as the admin or something like that. That could change thousands of file date timestamps on the computer. So it really muddles the story that we're trying to tell or trying to get to. Sometimes that's unavoidable. You can't avoid that. But we always recommend that if you've got a case that a particular user or employee or situation, that you get access to it quickly, and you treat it with the utmost care. Meaning, you don't want to run anything on it, you don't want to turn it on, you don't want to use it. I mean, at some point, you just want to keep it powered off until you can get it to forensic experts. The next thing you want to do, and this is the second rule, is never work on the original evidence. And so our process when we get any evidence in is we make 2 copies of it, and we make 100% bit for bit copy of it for whatever's available on the disk. So if it's a 100 gig hard drive, we often get the question, well, there's only 20 gigs worth of data on there. Well, that is what you see as an end user, but what we do is we make a full forensic 100% duplicate copy of it, so it's a 100 gig copy, and we never work on that original evidence. We set it aside, and we're working on those copies, and they're in a special format and so forth that makes it read only for us, but we can have full access to the disk. The next thing you want to do is we never trust the suspect's equipment, because if they're a sophisticated user, again, merely booting it, maybe in the wrong order or putting in the wrong password or putting in the wrong thing, could initiate wiping procedures, could initiate other spoliation procedures that they've built into the computer. So we don't want to trust the suspect's computer ever. And finally, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we document everything, because as we all know, these cases don't always happen in 30 minutes like they do on TV. So we've got to make sure that we've documented everything, and 2 years from now, when we have to testify to it or go back and what did we do on that? How did we do that? We've got the documentation, and we can refresh and get going. So those are the rules we live by. Those are what we want to do when it comes to digital evidence.
David, one other piece of technology we haven't mentioned, which we might want to highlight, is the write blocking technology. You want to explain to people what that's all about?
So, and again, that goes back to never working on the original evidence. We have specialized hardware both for mobile side and the hard drive side, that when we make those copies, we cannot write it's impossible for the bits and bytes to flow in the opposite direction. So we can't, it's read only to us, and it blocks any writes back to the original evidence. We also have, sometimes we've had to do it where we've had to recover very complex or damaged hard drives, and we do have the ability to do that also, again, with the write blocker.
Thank you.
Yep.
Johnny, take us through the pain barometer. Okay, you're muted. Let's see.
Can you hear me okay?
We can. Great.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so hearkening back to a few slides back when David talked about using a table saw without proper training, there are certain things that can go wrong if you're not applying diligence to the chain of custody or using the right tools or spoliating evidence. And this is really just a graphical depiction of those things. I certainly don't mean to depress anyone. They're all sort of byproducts of motions practice and the zealous advocacy process, but they are and can be quite severe if you get it wrong. And as with the prior slides and the commentary from Mark and David up till now, this is a complicated landscape. It really is. And if you go back to the 1980s and you look around for someone in a corporate America called a CIO, there was no such creature, right? The CIO was born of systems complexity, and the CFO became overwhelmed and unable to do both the financial and the systems related work. So the CIO was born, and 15 years later, the CISO was born. I think it's just a recognition that these things are complicated. They evolve over time. And the takeaway here should be to interact with your forensic specialist and force him or her to communicate with you in plain English. This is what we're trying to establish for this case. This is what we need to do in terms of diligence. I may need a written report. I may need you to testify. Allowing all of those things to be very clear for the technician allows us as forensic practitioners to give you the best guidance possible and to avoid every piece of real estate on this pain barometer here. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, next slide is for you, David.
Yeah, so just an example I wanted to give you to talk about how you can tell a story or how it changes throughout the process. So let me just give you a little background on this particular case. So we were hired to come out, and originally it was just, hey, we need to preserve this evidence because we're switching out management. It isn't performing as we expected it to. And we're just going to replace management. We're going to replace the team. And we think, though, potentially they could be taking some data with them, and we just want to lock down our system. So we flew out to Vegas and we started that process. Well, in that process, we actually started looking at things. We found some stuff while we were there in the middle of the night, and we found some bank statements that looked a little bit funny. I don't know about you, but I usually don't change the balances on my bank statements by hand. And that's what we exactly found when we were there. So we didn't know what this was originally when we got there. We just saw it sitting there. And so what we did is, like, this was some sort of, I don't know, it was like 900,000. They changed it to 1 million or whatever it was. They just kind of changed the first digits on some of these values here. And we're like, well, that's kind of interesting. So we dug into the computers. If we can go to the next slide, and we actually were able to find, it's a little hard to see on here, but in fact, actually, they were a creative design company. So they did design work. And so they had a lot of these sort of Adobe tools available to them, and they were able to sort of create their own bank statement. So in this case, they went out and took the design and took the logos and tried to replicate bank statements in Adobe Illustrator. And we were able to not necessarily find the original editing that they were doing in there, but way deep inside the cache, inside of a library, inside of this, we found little thumbnails, and we were able to analyze those thumbnails and then take it to larger statements and get some exports of that. And so if we go to the next slide, I think you can see that on your left-hand side there, you have what the bank statement really was, like the original bank statement. And then on the other side is what they came up with and how they designed it in their software. So
these are all defunct companies.
Yeah, these are all defunct companies. They don't exist. They're all gone a long time ago. So we tried to get rid of as much of that we can on here. And then it was very interesting. I mean, you can go in here and you can actually see, oh, hey, I need the March 2009 bank statement. Well, I'll just pull it up. It's in a layer. We've already designed that one. And so all these statements, there would be no reason other than committing fraud that you would be using Adobe Illustrator to edit your bank statement. So it's very, it was very telling that we were able to pull up these documents, look at the metadata, and see that they had fabricated all the bank statements. One interesting thing about it is the bank that these were in was actually a client of theirs, but they forgot that the bank had changed their logo. So halfway through the year, they got a new logo, but they kept using the old logo on the old bank statements and the format of their bank statements. So lots of fun stuff that we found in there. But again, it went from, hey, we just need everything preserved, to uncovering this sort of scheme here. And it was an interesting story. I've never seen anything like that before. It was pretty brash at what they were trying to do. I think they never thought they would get caught. Back to you, Mark.
Okay, we do have a question in the chat room, and it's somebody asks, Afshan asks, how does AI impact the ability of fraud detection? We might want to think about that as we're going through, unless anybody wants to take that now.
Yeah, it may be a good segue to the next slide there, Mark. When you think about the troves of data that are potentially probative or responsive to the charter you have as an attorney, hearkening back to David's sort of wheels within wheels metaphor of his creative accounting case, the sources of potentially useful data abound, right? And this list, however dizzying and an eye chart it may be, it's not exhaustive, right? So I think the takeaway here is the point I was making earlier, and this may hearken into the answer to the AI question as well, which is you should have a plain English conversation with your forensic practitioners, because they are, if they've seen this movie before, they're in a position to say, what about this? What about that? What about the personal devices of the employee that may or may not be the target of this investigation? What is the BYOD policy of the company in question? Do you have the right to ask for those data? Do you have a policy explaining that the data on that device belongs to the company, not the person? And as a furtherance to the answer to the AI question, this technology will continue to evolve. AI is a technology that allows for the sifting of remarkable speed through large tranches of data. But it presupposes that those data have been identified, obtained in a forensically sound and defensible manner, and processed or staged in a way that allows you to interrogate them for useful agendas. And AI can be remarkably effective in that regard. But when it comes to e-discovery or forensic techniques to get answers from data, it's that left-hand side of the bookshelf from the earlier slide.
Oh, we lost your audio, Johnny.
I think on another
giving a great synopsis, yeah.
On another note, on the AI side of it too, we are seeing a lot of, if we're talking about the generative AI type of thing, where we have video and audio that can now be replicated. So one's voice can be replicated through AI, or English, words and English phrases and whole things can be generated. I think there needs to be that is a very difficult thing to deal with, because we are so used to assuming that someone's voice is someone's voice and it's unique to them and we can recognize it. And now when we have computers having the ability to replicate our voices and sound like us, there's all sorts of fraud and things that could occur. You could voice print someone and then call and verify a bank account with it, and then have it automatically sort of come back and sort of walk through that process. And you're thinking you're talking to a real human when you're literally talking to a script kiddie that's sitting in his basement and typing in stuff in a chat session. And you're thinking you're talking to the CEO of the company, because they'll record someone and then be able to use that voice. So
and how to, and the answer, how one might ask, well, how do they obtain that? All these spam calls everybody gets every day, where you answer and there's a computer. They might prompt you with a question and you might answer yes. Is this your name? Yes. Well, there are companies out there that are recording your voice, even recording that positive response and applying it. You don't know what you just agreed to, right? So they're obtaining it in very subversive ways. Johnny, back to you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I would just say on the AI front, like many of the things we've talked about, many of the artifacts we've enumerated in this presentation already, it is possible to identify things that have been doctored using traditional forensic techniques. So if you are in a situation where AI might be implicated as something that's part of a fraudulent scheme or conveyance or larger scam, it's possible to identify things that have been altered. You may not be able to prove their veracity otherwise, but through other metadata like date and time stamping, you might be able to establish that something that was created after the date it was used is evidence of some kind of tampering. And so I think, again, back to the conversation you have with your technician, it's important to have that level of dialogue so that you're able to position the findings in the greater context of your legal strategy, or to identify the weaknesses in your own evidentiary case.
Absolutely.
And to that point also, I think it's important that you challenge and when you're presented with digital evidence that you challenge it. I can remember a case that we had that Facebook screenshots from a cell phone supposedly indicating that there was harassment and other things going on, when in fact those were all completely fabricated. And law enforcement moved forward with prosecuting and going after someone based upon someone's literally just a printout of a screenshot. And that can be very dangerous because once we got in there and started analyzing the phone and the other party's phone, none of those messages existed. And in fact, actually, we found on their software that faked all of it. So you can, there are all sorts of anti-forensics or fake tools that you can get. Now they're supposedly used for jokes and so forth, but they can be used for nefarious purposes also. So challenge the electronic evidence. Don't take it just literally on face value.
And listen to your forensic technicians, right? We've had a lot of clients who are very dead set on proving a negative, and it's incumbent upon the practitioners to push back on that and say, this could be, you know, exhaustively expensive because you're asking us to prove a negative, and here is how easy it is to manufacture the kind of artifacts we're looking at. We've had many cases like the one David has talked about where our clients have spent 6 figures trying to identify an originating text that likely was never a text. Someone took a screenshot of a doctored picture that was designed to look like a text, and then that was circulated. So it can be really expensive to prove a negative. Let's go to the next slide if we could, Mark.
Absolutely.
So among the other sort of emergent technologies, along with AI, we are seeing an increase in cases implicating blockchain. And there's nothing particularly magical or special about blockchain, except that it is somewhat novel and complicated. So it does require familiarity with the underlying architecture to make sense of it. Many of these systems are by their design public in nature, so they can be consumed if you have the right tools and knowledge and techniques to source the data and make sense of them. Most blockchain solutions are simply distributed ledgers, and therefore if you have access to the ledger, you can reconstitute transactions. You can look at the history of an address or an account on that ledger or within that network and begin to draw reasonable inferences. Now, some of these ledgers are enormous, dozens of terabytes in size, and they're not necessarily designed for such transactional interrogation. So they require a great deal of heavy lifting to get them to that interrogatable state. So again, it's incumbent upon you to ask your forensic technician to explain the complexities and the relative costs of making those things happen and making sense of those things. And likewise with mobile devices. No forensic technician worth his or her salt is going to image a phone and provide everything that's available on that phone. It would be, you know, a really expensive proposition to do that. And as soon as you ask for it, then you have to do something with that information as an attorney. So again, it all needs to tie to the theory of the case. There needs to be a substantive, plain English conversation with the technician about what is probative and useful, what kinds of data categorically are useful. Is it geographic in nature? Is it time-bound or chronological in nature? Is it financial in nature? Is it something that can lend itself to keyword analyses? All of those things become grist for the mill for the technician to start to winnow the haystack down to something that's very manageable and likely to create a more probative outcome. And I think this slide really illustrates that on a single device that we carry around in these supercomputers we put in our pockets, there's a wealth of information that's available once you have a forensic image of a phone. And if you ask us, the technicians, to make sense of it all, we'll happily do that, but you'll be very unhappy with the invoices that flow from that. So it's really important to explain what you think is useful about that piece of evidence, about that repository of data. A trade theft a deceptive trade secrets case is very different than a harassment case in terms of where the data might reside on a device that's carried around in your pocket. We'd also want to know what other systems that device might connect with in the corporate environment, so that there may be better evidence, or following the best evidence rule, a better place to look for that evidence that's more definitive in nature. So again, there's a lot of data out there. There's a lot of variety in the data. There's some ephemeral things to worry about with regard to mobile devices and other systems. So it really comes back to that coordination and collaboration you have with your technician. Many of us are not attorneys. Mark and I happen to be attorneys, but that's a coincidence. So we don't necessarily have an appreciation of the legal strategies that go into those things. And we do owe you a duty of candor and a duty of defensibility to anything we do. But if we don't understand what you're trying to establish or prove or baseline, it's very hard for us to be as useful as we could be. Anything else about this slide that you guys want to chime in on?
No, but we've got Afshan is asking some great questions here in the chat, and I'm glad he just brought up the challenges presented by encryption, decryption. So great opportunity for us to talk about that. And that's a great question.
Yeah, so well, there's a lot of challenges when it comes to encryption, because more and more data privacy becomes on mobile devices and desktops too, becomes a priority. And they're actually building in hardware issues, hardware designs into the phones where the data and the operating system are completely separated on physical chips that are one's encrypted and one is not so encrypted. And so it becomes a big challenge. It is a monumental challenge that there have been, quote unquote, some sort of workarounds, but we're trying to stay, the developers of this mobile forensic analysis software are constantly trying to stay ahead of that. A lot of that stuff is now moved. So for instance, Cellbrite has an advanced recovery service, and they use AI and cloud to try to get into those phones if we don't have the pins. And so it can be very, very challenging. Also on the desktop side, encryption can be very challenging also. We see this all the time. We get a hard drive and it's a Mac, or it's even a Windows PC with Bitwarden, and someone forgot their password, or they don't have the key, or IT doesn't know what it is. And, it becomes a challenge, and we do have ways to overcome that. Sometimes what has to happen is we have to decrypt we have to make an image of it, make a copy of it in its encrypted form, and then manually go in and decrypt it if we can, and then make another copy of it. So there are some tools to get around that, so you don't have to follow that process, but sometimes there's things we have to do. And if it's completely encrypted and wiped, there may be no way to get that back. So that's also important. And that makes
so so as David said, as those new technologies and new devices come out with more and more complex encryption, it's the forensic software developers that have to try to keep up with that, and at much expense to us as analysts, keeping that software updated so that we can continue to break into the newest devices. And I know everyone seems to have gone to the Apple phone, or unless you're probably a diehard like David and Johnny here, perhaps you're still you recognize the utility of Android, but Apple is notorious for locking down security, continuing to lock down security on their phone. So we have to try to stay ahead of that as analysts.
I would also say that it was stated in the affirmative, but maybe a negative way to frame it for the attorneys on the call is there is always a lag. It's a very asymmetrical kind of warfare, right? There's always a lag between the innovation in the technology and the ability for the forensics community to create a workaround for it. And it's really incumbent upon you to ask specific questions of us, and it's incumbent upon us to know the answers to those things. A great example is that a recent upgrade to the iOS, the operating system for Apple phones, made it much more challenging to get something that the major cell phone imaging software was able to do for many years, which is to produce the content of WhatsApp images on iPhones. And if you had imaged two identical phones from a hardware perspective, but one had gone through this operating system upgrade, but the other had not, you would have had zero trouble getting the unupgraded phone and all the content from WhatsApp you wanted or cared to digest. But you actually get a false signal from the upgraded phone because it tells you how many messages are. You ask it to produce everything from that, and then you interrogate what it's producing, but it's only giving you a fraction because the software on the forensic side hadn't yet caught up to the complexities around encryption, going back to the encryption question, that were introduced in the new operating system upgrade. So it's constantly give and take. It's a cat and mouse game that we're constantly balancing. And it's really tough to keep up with those things. Sometimes two phones that appear from an end user's perspective to look identical, you can get contacts but not calendar, email but not contacts. So it really just depends on what you're dealing with, and the technician needs to have a command of those things before you make promises about productions, because the last thing you want to do is put an asterisk or a footnote about something that's designed to be a complete production from a given repository.
Thank you. Let's talk about timestamps, David.
Yeah, so timestamps, we're talking about timelines telling a story. One of the key things that a computer forensic person's doing is attempting to reconstruct history, because we're not sitting there in front of the person when they're tapping away on their keyboard. We don't have cameras on them. Well, sometimes we have cameras, but not normally don't have cameras, so we don't know what exactly they're doing. So we have to rely upon the metadata and the timestamps and the information that's stored on these devices. And those can be super critical. Now, the way that they're sort of organized, typically we call MAC or created, modified, and accessed. Those are the key timestamps that you're going to see on most systems, even on cell phones and even on different OSs. Now, each OS will have a different little nuance to it of how it handles these type of things. But in general, I wanted to make sure that we convey what these mean so that you understand them a little bit better when you run across it and someone says, well, the file had a created date of X. You want to know what that is. So the created date on something is actually refers to when the file was created on the storage medium. So that may be different than when it was actually created in real life. Let me give you an example. If we write a Word document on my desktop computer and I give it a created date of today and I save it, and then a few days later, I don't do anything to the document. I literally copy it to a USB hard drive. I write it to a hard drive. There's a good chance that when I write it or move it to a different location, it's going to have the created date when it goes to that new media. Now, there's other metadata that we can get to validate that, but that created date that's in the operating system will have changed to the created date. It could also, so that's different than the actual date when I actually wrote it to the desktop. The great thing about Word documents and the Office documents is they store hundreds of other types of metadata, which we can use, which are fantastic for making our story and our life a little bit easier when it comes to those things. But maybe it's not something like that. Maybe it's something that that's important to the case. Maybe it's a deep dive into some other type of format of a file that you're dealing with, and it doesn't have that information. And so, if we can go back real quick. The next one is modified date. So that's the date that the user actually opens it and saves it and does a modification to it. And then finally, you have access date. Now, in the past, we've seen this on Windows machines where it actually is whenever they touch it, but that's kind of been turned off on most modern operating systems. So the access date typically is the same as the created date. So you got to be important that you understand these dates, and that's where it comes important working with your forensic technician and your expert to understand these dates and really get the meaning out of it, because first blush on them may mean something, but it may actually turn out to be something else. So again, David,
just on that aspect, data that metadata piece. There are also technologies, antivirus technologies, backup technologies that can alter those metadata. And so you don't want to go sort of screaming into the boardroom saying, I've got him, you know, we've got him dead to rights, he touched it on this date, when it can be explained through some other mechanized or automated fashion. It's a great point.
Yeah, absolutely. So these dates are very, very important, and they can change extremely. I mean, they changed in a blink of an eye or faster. So it's very important, again, going back to those 4 rules, that we handle the evidence and that we make sure we take extra care when looking at this, because data could change very quickly on it. So, you know, in this particular, it's hard to see on here, but again, the idea is that you see those created, those modified, then those record changed or accessed dates. Oftentimes you'll see something where you have a date that it says it was modified. It was created, I should say, let's put it this way. So it was modified before it was created. So how can something be modified before it was created? Again, that typically is because that sort of an indicator that it potentially was copied somewhere or copied to that location. And so it's all about looking at those information, understanding what was going on, and then going to see and reconstruct, and we try to then paint a picture and tell a story of, as best we can, the evidence is pointing to that this person logged in, they did this, they did this, they did this, and we try to reconstruct that on a timeline. And that's one of the goals oftentimes that we do, and we have to be able to prove that out with particular things, and making sure that we have it all nailed down as best we can. Otherwise, you may see things that aren't necessarily true. Another big area that people are using, a lot of storage is moving away from being locally stored, and it's being moved now onto the cloud. And so, as an example, there's logs that are behind the scenes. You know, this particular one, we can see that this is from Box.com, similar to Dropbox or any of those type of things. And they have logs, and they can see that these are sort of documents that were downloaded. So we can show that a particular IP address, again, that can be spoofed, that can be changed. So don't rely so much on IP addresses anymore, because with the proliferation of security VPNs and so forth, that can change. But regardless, the same type of logs and information is available even on a online systems typically. Now, not all of them are perfect, not all of them have all this data, but most of the big companies, especially on the enterprise level, can give you this metadata, the same type of metadata or similar to what we would get when we would be on a desktop or a mobile device. So that's important. That's another place, another source where we can get that information. We talked about briefly earlier about browser and internet activity, and we can reconstruct a lot of that stuff. I think we have, if Mark, if you bring it forward, I think there's another slide. Let me see if we left it in here. Yeah, so go back to that one. It's a little hard to see, but we had a cell phone case where we actually, we obtained a cell phone from folks that were accused of robbing ATM machines. Well, we were able to search their internet history, and they did a little career research, and they searched for things like the average sentence for a bank robber, and die packs in ATMs. So, you know, you got to do your career research, make sure you're going in the right direction there, and make sure you know what you're doing when you're ripping off.
They had good diligence on this.
Yeah, they had to do their due diligence and their quote unquote research on Facebook to make sure that they got the right thing. So, you know, that's always interesting to think. And we were also talking about briefly, I know we're running a little on time here, but you can stick a USB drive or hard drive into a system, and you look at it as an end user and you're like, man, there's nothing on here. There's no files, there's nothing. So we're just going to skip it. Well, you want to be cautious of that. Using forensic tools, what we can actually do is start seeing the bits and bytes. So on your left-hand side there, that's sort of the binary representation of what's on the drive. And if the drive was truly empty, if it was all sort of, yeah, there's really nothing here, what we would probably see over there would be all zeros. You would see just 0, 0, 0, 0, 0 all over the place there. And then we would be pretty confident that pretty much everything on there is blank. But if we start seeing all these other letters in here, these 44s and 72s and all sorts of digits in there, there's a good chance there's some data left in there. Now, it might not be 100% readable, but what we can do is then, using the tools we talked about earlier, we can convert that into text, so that what you see on the left-hand side when it gets fully converted really talks about gentlemen. It says, just a preliminary question about billing. So we get some actual text in English coming out of there of an email or a fragment. And this was all stored on an.
And again, what David's talking about, this is an instance where you're not viewing this data through an app, through an email, through an email program or other app. It's data that remains on the drive, but the directory for that data has been, cleared or deleted, but it's still there.
Yeah. Waiting
to be overwritten.
Yep. So all that can be very, very important for your case. It's not always something there, but it's very important that you take a look at that. And finally, again, we talked about this several times, but trade secrets, some of the things that we do and look for is, some people do it very simply. It may be the simplest thing that they do is they just forward all their email to their personal account with attachments. That's usually pretty easy on a corporate email system to spot and find. But we also have seen it where drives have been completely wiped out or attempted to be cleaned using cleaning software and anti-forensic software. So there's a full spectrum of what people do in terms of trying to go after, and if they're smart, they think they're smart, they try to do anti-forensics. There's entire websites developed and people track software related to anti-forensics. So if you go out and Google anti-forensics, it's again a battle that we're in, not only with the vendors of the legitimate benign vendors, going down the privacy route and increasing privacy on their devices, but we also have to contend with the hackers and also the anti-forensic teams that are, again, building tools they know what we do. They know how, from a criminal and standpoint and from other standpoints, look at that. So we always have to try to stay one step ahead of the game here.
Okay, well, that brings us towards the end of our hour. We do have a couple minutes for any Q&A, although I don't see anything in the chat. Hopefully our participants have found this information helpful. And I'll say again, if you have an idea for a topic or a speaker that might be interested in participating in the section's spring symposium seminar, please let us know. Lori Burton is coordinating that. She's actually looks like she is on the webcast as well. You can reach out to her at King & Spalding or myself at White Elm, and we'd love to hear from you. So unless any of the speakers have any closing comments, please go ahead now. Otherwise, we'll wrap things up and thank everybody for participating.
Yeah, well, thanks for participating and listening to what we have, and hopefully it was helpful, and we can maybe in the future help you with any of these type of cases.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Until next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's meeting. Thank you for joining and have a great afternoon.